Hello, good morning, everyone. It's so nice to be in Region 1 for the first time ever presenting for you guys. So for our school finance and legislative updates, as Josh said, we're going to dive into attendance projections. This module opened last Monday, October 17, and here's a little bit of information on it. Attendance projections are used to estimate student ADA, FTEs, and enrollment for the upcoming biennium. So the legislature will use these projections to determine public education costs for the 24-25 biennium. In other words, this means that the legislature is going to use this or finalized LPE data in your SOF for school years 23, 24, and 24, 25. So TA has said that historically they use a 5-year growth average, or they look at 5-year historical growth to calculate their projections that they preloaded into the attendance projection module. But this year it's been a little strange. There was some negative growth and also a negative or a smaller ADA to enrollment percentage. And they said that if they project using negative growth of, I think, 0.31%, that would have a negative impact on funding, of course. So instead, they have inflated the 22-23 projections that they did previous year or the year before, and have applied some or they have calculated how much it would bring, how much they would need to bring statewide levels to 92% ADA to enrollment percentage, and also a point, I believe it's a 0.87. I'm sorry, I don't know the growth rate off the top of my head, but basically they want to.
They have it in they sent out a TAA, is that right?
Yes, these details are in the TAA, but they basically want to match 2019 so they can bring it back to pre-pandemic levels. So please make sure that you guys submit your attendance projections module by December 14th. It's due at 5 p.m. If you don't submit it, TEA will just use their projections. And to submit this, your district will just need to, or your LEA just needs to go into the TEAL and the FSP program and either accept TA's projections or enter your own based on local factors. And lastly, TA has indicated that there will be a first indicator related to the accuracy of your LEA's projections. And I know that it's very hard to project, especially recently, what your ADA or enrollment will look like in a couple of years. So there's some more details in indicator 15 that shows that basically gives you a range of your district size and your percentage, your margin of error. Off the top of my head, I remember that if your district has more than 10,000 students, you need to be within like 7%. And if your district has, I think, less than 1,000 or 500, you need to be within 35%. Do we have a question in the back? Not yet? Okay. Thank you. For the ones in Zoom land, Romalda said that David Marks presented here at TASBO recently, and he said that if your LEA does not submit the attendance projection module, they will not pass the first indicator for 24 and 25. Okay, so some SOF near final runs. I know we've brought up these slides recently, so we're just gonna skip through the first two or go to the next one. TA in the last couple months has been updating the near final SOF for school year 21-22. The red ones are more recent updates. So at the end of last month, they incorporated information for special purpose districts. They did a transportation update for late submitters. They did some fixes for recapture netting. And more recently, they've also made some updates for the public education grant, ADA. They did some pre-K updates and a tax information survey update, probably for late submitters as well. Later that month, they incorporated SB 1882 campus data. And in October, they did a lot of bond updates and then did some coding updates in there, and also updated PEMS for Comp Ed. And last week, I believe they did the additional day school year ADA.
One other thing I want
Amy,
to
we
point
have a
out,
question in the chat. What if we allow TEA to use their projection and if they are off, does that count against us on the first?
well, yeah. So as Amy said earlier, if you don't submit your projection, then if you don't approve it, then you'll fail the first. If you approve TEA's projection, I think that you're still giving your stamp of approval on it, and so you'd still be held, to account for the consequences of being off in that projection. So I don't know, in the chat, does that answer their question? All right. The other thing I just want to point out, and we mentioned it before, but for purposes of your state spending requirement, I know y'all are probably down the line on your audit or getting that work done. Your spending requirement ties back to 37,791. That's the run that was published on September 8th. That's your actual ADA that you submitted through PEMS. Okay, so that is what your state spending requirement is calculated on. So when you're calculating 55%, you're 100% for dyslexia, whatever it is, make sure you're looking not at the most recent run, right, but at the run that represents your actual ADA. Next up, we're going to talk about the bond guarantee program. This is something that we are keeping a very close eye on, and we're, to be honest, we're a little bit concerned about. For those of you that don't know, the bond guarantee program is essentially the state of Texas's program that guarantees your debt, and it helps all districts across the state secure a higher credit rating, right? So on your own, if you went and sold your debt at the market, right, you may not be able to secure a AAA rating and get those lower interest rates, but through this program, you can get the backing of the state, the permanent school fund, and secure those lower interest rates. Okay, so this program, I think last estimate I saw, saves school districts every year around $430 million. So this is a big deal, and it's very helpful to help lower your cost of borrowing. The thing to point out here is that there's a capacity limit for the bond guarantee program, and that limit is tied to the size of the fund. You can see that there's really two limits in play. The sort of governing limit is always the lowest one, right? So whichever one's lowest in this case, and pretty much for the past, probably 20 years, it's been I'm sorry, that should read the IRS. It's not the IRA, not the not the Irish Revolutionary, whatever. But yeah, that's the IRS rule. Excuse the typo. But the IRS sets a limit that's 5 times the value as it was back in December of 2009, right? So they took that snapshot in time, and it's been frozen ever since. Okay, and so because of that, that is locked in at $117.4 billion, right? That sounds like a lot of money, but when we're talking about all the bonds that are issued from every district across the state, we are very quickly coming up to the end of that capacity. Whoops. And you can see that outlined here. So we have about 108 billion in the program now. About 105 is just existing. There's 2.5 that's in process, and then almost $1 billion was approved last month. So that capacity is already spoken for. The SBOE requires that the states set aside 5% to sort of keep that in reserve. So that gobbles up about $6 billion in capacity. And so at the end of September, we have around $3.5 billion left. And if you remember, we passed, I know 16 billion were on the ballot back in May. We got another 16 billion coming up in November. I think, do you know offhand how much was passed in the 51? Yeah. So yeah, about 8 billion and some change was passed in May. So that's will be sold, and all those bonds will be going into the bond guarantee program. So you can see we're coming up against that limit. And so we expect that if nothing changes, nothing happens, the bond guarantee program capacity is going to be all used up by the end of this calendar year. And so what would happen if the IRS doesn't change their rule, or if the SBOE doesn't do anything, or nothing changes? The capacity would dry up, and then there'd be, for that last month, probably in December, the agency would start prioritizing applications to the bond guarantee program, right? They'd start with, and they'd prioritize it based on wealth per student. Okay, they'd start at the bottom and work their way up. Once they exhaust the capacity, then that's it for everybody else. TEA does have the authority to stand up a sort of safety valve, right? A backup program called the Bond Enhancement Program. Essentially, it works kind of the same way as the Bond Guarantee Program. The Bond Guarantee Program secures the debt with permanent school fund, right? The Bond Enhancement Program secures the debt with FSP appropriations, right? So what the state appropriates for the FSP, that kind of sits right in the bank until it's sent out. And so they secure it with those funds. However, this has never been done. We've had instances where the bond guarantee program, the capacity is used up, but TEA's never made use of this enhancement program that's in statute. I think it last happened in 2009 and maybe in 2005 before that, if I recall. And so we don't know how the market would react, right? If, let's say, we exhaust capacity and this bond enhancement program has to come online, we don't know if that would get a AAA rating, right, from the market in the same way that the bond guarantee program would. And so, we'd really be in unknown territory, and districts that are trying to sell their debt on the market would be in a tricky situation. They probably have to be facing higher interest costs, and we don't want that. We want our education dollars to go into the classroom, not to bankers in New York, right, charging us high interest rates. Yeah, that's my stump speech. And so how do we avoid this? There's a couple things that we can do. There's some things we can do in the state, right? The SBOE can lower that 5% reservation, right? So right now it's 5%. They can lower it, somewhere south of that. And for each percentage they shave off, that'd be about $1 billion, $1.2 billion in additional capacity. So that's not going to solve the problem. That's not a long-term fix, but it could be a band-aid, could be a bridge to until we can get a more permanent solution in place. We have seen some action and advocacy from the Texas congressional delegation. They've sent a letter to the IRS. I got that one right, no typo there. They have a letter to the IRS asking them to update that capacity, right? So not tie it to 2009 anymore, but update it to a more current year to reflect the growth in the PSF since 2009. And so that request has been made. For anyone that's ever needed to contact someone at the IRS or needed the IRS to do something, that they don't move particularly quickly. So hopefully with a congressional request, they can do that. But they've acknowledged it. TEA has been pushing this for 2 years now. They've been having conversations with the IRS for 2 years, and we're still at this place where the IRS hasn't updated this, and so I'm not hopeful that the IRS is gonna be the way we solve this problem. The SBOE has also sent letters to the Texas congressional delegation asking them for relief. There's one other way to solve this problem, and that's to change federal law so that the IRS doesn't have to do a capacity requirement, right? Right now, the IRS comes in and because of federal statute says, here's what your capacity is for the bond guarantee program. We could just change that law. And the current version of the federal spending bill, the HR 9044, that has to pass by the end of this calendar year or there'll be a federal shutdown, right? So hopefully that can get across the finish line. But in the current version of that bill includes a provision that would strike this requirement for the IRS to set a capacity limit, right? And so we'll see, hopefully that is still in the final version of the bill that makes it over the finish line at the end of the year. But that would, again, remove the federal capacity limit. And then we would just be left with the SBOE limit of around 150 billion. So you can see that helps, right? However, with the way the bond market has been, I'd imagine we'd be hitting even this higher state limit after a number of years. So we, even if we did get rid of this federal capacity limit, we may need to revisit that 3.5 times capacity limit that's in state law during this session. So there's a number of ways to solve this problem, but it does need to be solved really by the end of this calendar year so that school districts aren't out there on their own in the bond market and facing higher interest costs than they would otherwise need to. So any questions about bond guarantee program, how that could impact you? I would recommend y'all talk to your FAs and say, if we go and sell this bond or sell this debt, what would our credit rating be, right? They could hopefully help you give you a ballpark of what that would be, and they could advise you on what the likely interest premium you'd have to pay because of that, right? It's kind of hard for us to estimate that, and so I would really recommend y'all talking to your FA and seeing, okay, what would the impact of us not getting that state guarantee be? And just to be clear, this applies to folks that maybe if you went out for a bond in the past 3-4 years, right, you could still be selling some of that debt, right? And if you're not getting that guaranteed, then you could still be impacted by this. All right, we're gonna switch gears over to ESSER, everyone's favorite topic right now. I know we're gonna have Mr. Green on here, so I'm gonna move through these slides pretty quick, but do interrupt me if you guys have questions. This is stuff y'all already know. Just wanted to include a little overview of ESSER and kind of how it was used, supplant versus supplement. ESSER 3, the largest package there was fully supplemental, came to y'all as entirely new funds. You guys could, of course, supplant on locally, and I know a lot of y'all did that, and we'll talk about that more here in a minute. The allowable uses are consistent across all 3 ESSER packages. The one thing that is unique about ESSER 3, as y'all are aware, is it does have that 20% reservation, and I think Mr. Green will be talking about that later, so I'm gonna move on past that for now. Here is some information that TEA presented to the House Appropriations Committee a couple months back regarding how districts are spending their ESSER dollars. So you can see this is as of March of this year. Districts were almost all the way through ESSER 1. 21% was drawn down for ESSER 2, and 10% was drawn down from ESSER 3. Fast forward to, I got some formatting issues here. Fast forward to September 1, almost fully done through ESSER 1, 98%. ESSER 2 is about halfway done. halfway drawn down. ESSER 3 is almost at 30% drawn down. So y'all are trying to move through this money and be compliant with all the regulations and requirements around it. There is some concern that as we get closer, particularly to the end of ESSER 3 grant period, that there could be some money left on the table. That's a situation we all want to avoid. But I think we're making progress on drawing that money down. And the one thing this doesn't reflect is y'all's plans to over the next several years, right? So I'm sure in your plans that are posted to your websites, you guys have outlined a plan to fully spend your ESSER dollars. And so this is just what TEA has received again as of September 1. It doesn't reflect all the plans that you guys have in place. Here's how districts are using the ESSER funds. This is essentially a summary of that state expenditure report that you guys submitted. And so you can see the leading use is additional teachers, about at 10%. You guys are using 9.5% to cover student services. This is counselors, nurses, food service, that kind of thing. Another 9% is going towards teacher pay increases. 500 million is going to technology. And so these are the kinds of things that I think we expected leading into the publication of this data. But just know a lot of those things are recurring costs, right? According to that categorization, about 28% are. The one thing that got a lot of attention during that committee meeting is 42% of ESSER supplemental, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3, the state doesn't know if it's recurring or one-time costs. And so this frustrated some lawmakers. They wanted more insight into that. TEA, I think, maybe following up with another data collection to get some more information on that. We'll have to see what the agency does. But just know, and you guys, we've talked about this before, but make sure you have an exit strategy for ESSER if you are using it for recurring costs. Just plan for that accordingly, and make sure your community is well aware of what that plan is. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the data is only published at the state level. We could maybe ask Mr. Green, and he may even present it later, but that's something that his group could provide. So as I mentioned, all this data is lagged and it's incomplete, and things are categorized maybe in not the most straightforward way. And so, but that's the story that's being told, right, in the public about the Capitol. So I'm urging districts to make sure that your leadership team at your districts, your board members, your superintendent, they're all out there telling the district story, how you guys are spending ESSER, what's the plan, what's the exit strategy, how are you using ESSER to help get kids caught back up, right? You need to keep on talking about that as much as possible. Additionally, it talked about if we get to a position where we're leaving ESSER dollars on the table, this is going to undercut future arguments up at the Capitol for more state dollars, right? If they can point to this pile of ESSER money that expired and we didn't spend, then it's going to make it harder for us to say increase the basic allotment, right? Or increase the weights, or index to inflation, or all this stuff. And so we really want to avoid being in that position as we're moving into next session and future session. And so we talked about this already. If you are using it to supplant locally, you're using ESSER to sort of offset local dollars and either put those in fund balance or spend those on other items. Just make sure you have an exit strategy. You know how it's going to wind down after those ESSER funds go away. And it is a balancing act between sort of what you supplant and put in fund balance and what you use immediately. Students obviously have needs coming out of the pandemic. all the learning, the lost learning time. They need to get caught back up, and ESSER is a great resource to do that. But you do want to avoid setting yourself up for a fiscal cliff. And another thing that we talked about, I think last time I was here or virtually, was just the interaction with your title programs, right? If you supplant locally with ESSER, right, you use ESSER funds to pay for local or expenditures that would have otherwise been local expenditures, that's going to hurt you for your title program maintenance of effort, right? Because now that's a federal expenditure, right? That teacher salary isn't a local expenditure anymore. It's a federal expenditure, and you can't use it for your title programs. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Also related to ESSER, it's getting that time to do your local maintenance of equity calculations. We did a whole webinar on this last year. We'll probably do another one if there is demand. But it's going to work essentially the same as last year in terms of who's accepted, what your options are, that kind of thing. So just know that smaller districts, they are accepted from the local maintenance of equity requirement under ESSER 3. You can see 815 districts were accepted, so they don't have to worry about local maintenance of equity at all. TA has published a list that's, I think they sent that out as well. If you don't have it, reach out and let me know. I can get it to you. Check if you're on that list. I think they're going to update that list based on fall snapshot as well. So right now it's based on some schedule in your title. I think SC 5000, I think is what it is. Some schedule in your title application, right? So you may be accepted now because of that schedule that you submitted in your title stuff. But once TEA updates that with your October snapshot information, if you're on the cusp of this enrollment stuff, just know that TEA will be reaching out to you directly if you were accepted and now you're not, or vice versa, right? So they've said that they're going to contact y'all directly. Did you have a question? Yeah, we're going to get to that here in a moment. Yeah. So there's 3 options if you're not automatically accepted, right? If you're of those 815, great, you don't have to worry about this anymore. But if you're not, there's 3 options for compliance. Self-certification, in my opinion, this is the easiest one. And I think it's one that districts may not really be taking advantage of fully. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. You can apply to USDE for an exception. This is, we don't really know what the odds are for this, but I would put it as difficult. It's probably not very likely. 2, yeah, okay. So yeah, 2 applications the USDE approved last year, just to accept them from the local maintenance of equity stuff. So that seems like a really steep hill to climb. But if there's something specific, unique that happened to your district, other than just the pandemic that happened to everybody, then maybe that's something to consider. The last one is using that dreaded tool that the agency provided. I should say the tool is helpful. It's just a lot to work through, particularly for bigger districts with a lot of campuses. And it's doing that equity analysis. And so I'm not going to go through all the details on how to do that equity analysis. If you do have questions, I know I helped probably a dozen districts in Region 1 work through that last year. And so if you want to sit down and catch up, then we can do some MO equity stuff together. Then let me know and be happy to do that. The self-certification that we talked about, essentially what you're doing when you self-certify is you're saying to USDE that the district did not and will not reduce state and local per pupil funding. And I have to check if that also applies to the FTEs, right? Because MO equity is kind of a 2-part thing. It's funding and FTE. So I'll have to follow up on that. But that's what you're saying to USDE. We didn't do any cuts, at an aggregate level, right? And it's really just a 1-page form. You fill that out, ship it over to USDE, and then you're now in compliance with MO equity. Okay. We don't know what USDE's follow-up is going to be yet. So I don't know, folks that have, who self-certified last year? Did you? Has USDE followed up with y'all or asked for any backup or documentation or even acknowledgement of that? No? Okay. Yeah, so we don't know. I don't think we know yet what that could be. We're advising folks to make sure you keep that data, sort of proving your case, right? Because I would imagine eventually they would come. But again, I can't say here today what, you need these three things ready to go. The exception, I think, is pretty straightforward. And the approvals will be rare. I guess we had 2 last year, but that seems like a difficult path. You can conduct the equity analysis using that tool that TEA has prepared. That's due January 27th. The tool, I believe TA has had some trainings on the new version of the tool. It's not going to be populated. Last year, they did pre-populate it with some of your data in your campuses. This year, they're not going to do that, but I think they are providing you a separate document that lists out your campuses. I think that's how they're going to handle it this year. So just know that there will be a little bit more data entry involved, I think, this time around, but essentially the test is the same. One thing I want to encourage y'all, if you don't want to self-certify and you're not automatically accepted, make sure you explore the district-wide and the grade span tests, right? I can't tell you how many districts across the state I sat down with, and they were freaking out about MO equity, and they're saying we're not compliant, but they're only looking at the district-wide test, right? But that's all of your campuses. There's this whole other way you can be compliant with a grade span grouping, and you can only choose certain grade spans. And so, and for, I would say probably 60–70% of those that weren't compliant on the district-wide test, we could be strategic and find a way to get them compliant on the grade span side, right? And so I would encourage y'all, if you are going through this second round and you're finding that you're non-compliant on the district-wide side, reach out, let me know, and we can talk more about that grade span strategy. And I'm going to hand it back over to Amy to give us an update on the Virtual Ed Commission. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there was that late liquidation for ESSER 1, right? Yeah. And so that has been announced. I think it was the end of the grant period was September 30th, and that was announced on September 29th. So you had a lot of time to react and prepare for it, right? And so that information is out there. And I think TEA, I think they have it on, and I would imagine Corey would be a great person to follow up more about that. I don't know if it's, there are some rules around what sort of expenditure could be allowed beyond the grant period. I think you have to have ordered it and all this stuff before the grant period ends, and it has to be some reason like a supply chain issue or something that delayed it, right? So there's some restrictions, right, on what kinds of things can go beyond the grant period. And I would imagine I'm going to save that one for Corey. Mm-hmm. Okay, so essentially, just to repeat that for folks, if you come into possession of whatever thing you're purchasing after 9/30, then it won't be eligible. Okay. 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 Yeah, see, I thought the whole rationale behind the extension was folks that like couldn't get computers in time and get that shit. Okay.
Josh, we
well,
do have a
learn something
question
new.
in chat.
Yes.
On the topic of virtual remote learning, how will we be funded this year for the ADA showing up as remote ADA? And then we saw numbers in our first 6 weeks reporting kids who got the flu or even COVID, and we offered the option to attend remotely.
Right. So for purposes of funding, ADA is treated the same no matter where it occurs, right? If it's online ADA, if it's remote synchronous, remote asynchronous, if it's in person, that ADA is plugged in just the same on your summary finance as all your other ADA. So the funding, once you generate an ADA, right, no matter which method, it works the same in terms of funding purposes. The thing to mention, of course, with Senate Bill 15 is there are restrictions on how you generate the ADA, right? So in person, you're going to generate an ADA just if the kid shows up, right? It doesn't matter what their grades are. It doesn't matter what their star score is, right? They're going to generate an ADA even if they're not a great student, right? On under the local remote learning program, there's these sort of conditions that the student has to meet depending on if they were majority remote last year or not. There's a set of conditions that the student has to meet to generate an ADA, right? So it looks at the student's absences. I think if they have more than 10 unexcused absences, if they are failing a class, if they scored below a certain level on their star, they are not eligible to generate a virtual ADA, right? And so that's the framework that we have for this year. It's everything that was described under Senate Bill 15, and I think I've sent along some resources to y'all on that at previous FAC meetings. If you have questions about that, here in a second, I'll put my email in the chat. We can follow up. But essentially, the upshot is the only difference between virtual and in person is those conditions on how you generate an ADA. Once an ADA is generated, right, virtual or in person, it works the same through the school finance system. And then there was a second part to that question, Oscar, something to do with if the student has the flu, can they do remote learning? Is that, can you repeat that, Oscar?
The second part of the question is, we saw numbers in our first 6 weeks reporting for kids who got the flu or even COVID, and we offered the option to attend remotely.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know if that's so much a question, but yeah, you know,
actually, there's another follow-up question. It says, so if we see numbers internally, we may not see them at the end because of all the factors you just mentioned, correct?
If you may not see the number, well, so and every student information system is different, but I believe most of them break out the instructional method, right? You can see a series of reports. I know if you use Ascender or Skyward, I think both of those do that. You can break out the reports by in-person instruction. You can break out the reports by remote synchronous, remote asynchronous. And so you should be able to see who is, like, how much participation and how much ADA is being generated by your virtual program. I think you would need to check with your provider because, for example, remote conferencing, it kind of depends on how you're running your program for sick kids, right? So you could do it like COVID, for example. I believe if they're a close contact or if they're positive for COVID, they would qualify for remote conferencing. That's the avenue that existed prior to the pandemic for kids that were suffering temporary medical conditions, but they added COVID to that, so it does apply there a little bit. I believe that remote conferencing ADA would just show up. I think that's actually treated differently depending on your student information system. So I would reach out to your SIS vendor and ask them, if we are coding someone as receiving virtual education through our remote conferencing program, where does that show up? Okay, so your district may not be serving those students through the remote conferencing program, that may be serving them through your local remote learning program. And so it varies on how your district has structured its virtual education, and it varies on your student information system. But I think if they're being served through the local remote learning program, that would be, at least all the vendors I've seen, they have a separate series of reports that you can run, in-person series, a remote asynchronous series, and a remote synchronous series that you can run. Okay, now I'm going to hand it off to Amy to talk more about the Virtual Ed Commission and their leading up to the recommendations.
Thanks, Josh. So looking forward to the next legislative session. Virtual education has been a hot topic, of course. And in the most recent committee meeting a couple of weeks or last week, the Virtual Ed Commission focused on 6 different areas to begin talking about drafting recommendations. So these 6 areas, as they laid it out, are full-time virtual or hybrid school, supplemental course provider, emergency stopgap, virtual learning, teacher preparation and support, accountability, and funding. So they are just talking about preparing to bring together draft recommendations, and these are expected to be released at the next commission meeting on November 30th. So here are a few things that I took away from their last meeting falling into these 6 categories. Overall, the commission, the theme of I think their intent is to simplify the remote learning or the virtual and hybrid school framework, policy framework, to make it more common and in line with traditional brick and mortar schools, and also to potentially fund on enrollment. So I'm going to go through some of these bullet points here. There was discussion about establishing a unified policy framework. Josh just went over 3. I think the commission said that there's like around 7 all in all in statute currently. There was some talks about expanding the Texas VSN course catalog through a simplified approval process by TEA, or phasing in some sort of new supplemental course catalog. They talked about revising the student attendance accounting handbook language to make it more LEA friendly during an emergency for the emergency virtual education framework. There was some talk about clearly defining what a disaster or an emergency was, and that could clarify what the framework will look like. There was a lot of interest in offering some sort of optional micro-credentialing process for teachers that want to teach virtually. This is the commission's way of thinking that's what help incentivize teachers who want to do this to have this kind of professional credential on their resume. So next, the commission talked about establishing an approval process for new virtual programs that emphasizes thoughtful planning and design prior to the launch. They've talked during meetings, they've talked a lot about how districts did have to do emergency virtual education during the pandemic, but the ones that were really successful put a lot of planning and thought into launching their program and evaluating it. There was talk about having an accountability system that was similar to brick and mortar. This could look, I think, like testing and also evaluating teachers too, through like in-person, I guess, check-ins or something like that. And there was a lot of interest for providing transparency to families and students about all the options that could be available. A little bit more on the funding. The commission said that their goal was to establish a fiscally neutral enrollment-based funding system and modify the reporting requirements around that so they can capture enrollment. I think this is because TA reported that almost 10,000 students from, I guess, Snapshot were not eligible for FSP funding under SB 15. So if they move to an enrollment-based system, these students would be counted there. The commission is also interested in providing startup grants. I think this will help LEAs technically when they're creating and launching their programs. They're talking about providing TA and additional FTE to help orchestrate that technical assistance and then do other administrative work. And they're interested in continuing an ADA-based model for remote conferencing for those emergency situations. Okay, so we'll move on to school safety. So earlier this summer, Governor Abbott announced this $105.5 million to support school safety and mental health initiatives. You can see this breakdown here, and you guys have probably seen this slide before too. The $50 million for bullet-resistant shields through the governor's public safety office. That deadline has passed somewhere, I think, last month, but there is still the $17.1 million to purchase silent panic alert technology. Josh and I found, I guess, a webpage on TA's website that was posted early in October that they have since taken down related to this grant. We've reached out to the agency, and the commissioner, through a commissioner call, has confirmed that there will be more information forthcoming about this grant. We got a sneak peek of before the agency was ready.
Yeah, just real quick, they had originally announced October 5th release of this grant, and then for reasons we are not privy to, they pulled it down. I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but you know, as Amy mentioned, the commissioner said that that money should be more information how you guys can access that should be announced soon. So.
Okay, and more recently, just yesterday, Texas leadership announced a transfer of almost $875 million to support critical public safety and recovery initiatives. Some of the big major items are listed here. There's going to be $400 million to assist school districts in replacing or upgrading doors, windows, fencing, communications, and other safety measures. There will be $15 million to help Uvalde build another elementary school. And then there's going to be some, I guess, two other major funding categories to help with border security, and another $100 million that will be provided to the TDEM for COVID-19 response.
So, you know, we are grateful for the $400 million. I do want to point out that that $9.72 that you guys get currently, that's about $100 million statewide, right? So we're looking at $40 per kid, right, with this. So just keep that in mind. We are definitely going to be pushing for an enhanced school safety allotment this next session. But we are appreciative that some money is coming now. I do want to point out that $400 million, if you remember back to our last FAC meeting, we talked about all the savings the state saw, right, from lower attendance, right? They budgeted for a certain level of ADA. Even with the hold harmless, it came down below that. They saved north of $1 billion. The first week that our new CFO, Leo Lopez, was in office, he published an op-ed suggesting that the state, instead of just taking those billions of dollars and putting it in its, and saving it, that they actually use that and give it back to schools. And one of the ideas he proposed was to send it back to schools for school safety, right? And so that's exactly what the governor did. He reappropriated some of those FSP savings and sent it back sent it back to y'all through this budget execution authority. So we're excited about that. But obviously a lot more still needs to be done. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. That's what's kind of represented on this slide. This kind of shows some of the various proposals that are out there now, and sort of what kind of scale, what that really means for y'all at a campus level. So you can see the blue here is the $9.72 students per ADA that you get. And then this represents various campus sizes along the bottom, right? So at $100 or at 100 kids, right, that current allotment generates $972. There's one proposal out there that would increase the dollar amount from $9.72 up to $150. And that would help certainly. You can see at 100 kid campus that brings in $50,000. That's that would, I'm sure y'all could definitely put that to use. But when we think about the costs of securing a campus, one of the things that a lot of folks would like to do is put an SRO on a campus, right? Cost of an SRO, roughly speaking, with equipment and salary and benefits and all that, is around $100,000. $150 per ADA for small campuses, that doesn't come close, right, to covering those costs, right? And we think kids on small campuses need to be as secure as kids on big campuses. And so this per ADA approach, if there's not a floor or some sort of minimum amount, is problematic for the small campuses, right? And so you can see you would need about a campus the size of 700 kids on it to generate enough money to put an SRO on there. And that's just SRO, right? If you want to put cameras on the campus, or you want to do some of the door, fix door locks, or do to get counselors, right? Sort of bolster your mental health supports on the campuses, right? That's not included on here. This is just showing the cost of an SRO. So, again, we think that $150 is obviously an improvement over the current allotment, but an overwhelming majority of campuses, more than 70%, are less than 700 kids, right? And so even at $150 a pop, you're not going to generate enough money to even hire an SRO for the campus. And so what we would like to see is something that if the allotment has to remain ADA based, that there be some sort of floor, right? So every campus is funded as if it had 700 students, for example, right? Do some sort of minimum allotment for each campus, and then aggregate that up to the district level. And so, we're not suggesting that the dollars flow directly to the campus. I know a lot of superintendents get nervous when they hear us talking about campus costs. We're not saying that the dollars wouldn't go through central office. Of course, central office would prioritize and distribute the dollars across the campuses, but we want to make sure the campus needs are met, right? And so some sort of funding floor, depending on the number of campuses that you have, I think is going to be a critical piece to get in place during this next session. And so, security conversations often, when we start talking about security, we often start talking about facilities. And so that's another thing that we're going to be talking about during this next session. I know a lot of folks in Region 1 do get considerable amount of funding from the IFA EDA programs. But as y'all are aware, the guaranteed yield on those has not been updated in many, many years, right? And so when those programs were first in place, the state assistance that was generated covered just over a third of the bond payments. Now it's only 2.5%, right? So that has just been stagnant, and it hasn't improved at all over the course of the program. And so one thing we're pushing folks in Austin to consider is updating those allotments and also tying them to the basic allotment, or tying them to some measure of inflation, right? So that way we can kind of set it and forget it, right? It's not this static thing that sits in the law books and doesn't change, right? It sort of grows as inflation grows or grows as the basic allotment grows, and can keep up with y'all's the reality you're facing when you're going out to build new schools. The other thing, of course, that all folks are pushing for this session is increase the basic allotment. Just want to point out that if they did increase the basic allotment right now, obviously it's 6160, they increased it and didn't make any other changes, that would trigger a couple things that I just want y'all to be mindful of. One, that 30% calculation that we all did in 1920, right? If they increase the basic allotment, that law is still on the books, right? So you'd have to go through that exercise again. Okay, so just be aware of that. And that's 30% of your year-over-year growth in revenue has to go towards teacher compensation. I know I'm probably giving y'all terrible flashbacks thinking about that worksheet you had to fill out for TEA, but that requirement's still on the books, and it's tied to any time the basic allotment is increased. The other thing it would trigger is compression of your copper pennies. I know a lot of y'all in this area do have copper pennies, and that's essentially, you have, and we'll talk about tax compression here in a minute and tax rates, but you have tier 1, the 8 pennies on top of that are golden. Any pennies above that are your copper pennies, okay? They increase the basic allotment, that would be compressed, okay, by the amount of increase that there is. And so just like we had in the first year of House Bill 3, right, for those of you that had a TRE, went up to 17, you were compressed down, that 17 pennies became 1383, right, once House Bill 3 was put into effect. And so that same kind of mechanism, again, still on the books. If they increase the basic allotment, that would trigger a series of things that would result in copper penny compression. Basic allotment, we obviously support that. It lifts all boats, but it is costly. It would cost the state around $800 million annually for a $100 increase in the basic allotment. So, for state budget purposes, that'd be about $1.6 billion. But, the state does have a lot of money. We'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. And so this is a good time to be asking for a basic allotment increase. One big thing we're pushing for is that the basic allotment be linked to inflation, okay? And that way it kind of grows as inflation grows. I'm sure y'all have, felt the sting of inflation recently. And we really think it's time. And right now, I think we have a good case to make, because inflation is what it is, that we can get some sort of automatic recalculation of the basic allotment that's tied to inflation increases. And so that's a big thing we're going to be pushing this session. And I think given the resources that the state has and inflation being what it is, I think we have a decent chance of getting that done. So this just shows the basic allotment since 2014. It's increased a little bit since then, or it increased a little bit from 2014 to 2019, from 4950 to I think 5140, and then obviously House Bill 3 came in and brought it up to 6160, where it has sat ever since. This just kind of shows what the basic allotment could have looked like if it was indexed to inflation. The green is based on the inflation that occurred over the preceding biennium. And so you can see, because of how high inflation has been recently, that would result in a basic allotment of almost $7,400 in 2024, right? So that would be really welcome news, I think, for a lot of folks. I think that may be a little bit too much for the state's budget to handle, even with their the reserves that they have right now. And so one other idea that we've seen discussed and we kind of model out here is adjusting it on sort of a 10-year average inflation growth, right? And so that's a little bit of a more bite-sized basic allotment increase for the state to handle. And so you can just see how that would sort of play out, or that would have played out since 2020 if that were in place. And so, of course, the state does have a lot of money to spend. They have $27 billion in GR surpluses. They got another $14 billion in the rainy day fund. They have $3 billion in from the American Rescue Plan. I should mention those first two bullet points are projections of where the state will be at the end of the 22-23 biennium. We think, given the way sales tax are coming in, and we just saw latest numbers that the economy is growing, albeit slower than I think some would like, but it's still growing. And so we may even, once we get to the end of this biennium, we may even have more money than this, right? And so the state is flush with cash. Cash is not going to be an issue during the next session. The thing that's going to be an issue is the state spending limits. Okay, so there's in statute and in the Texas Constitution, there's various limitations on what the state can appropriate each biennium. Okay, and I think there's 5 total. These 3 are really the only ones that matter. And so I'm going to start actually with that second one, the pay-as-you-go limit, because it's the simplest to explain. It's just you can't spend more money than Controller Hager says the state's going to bring in over the next 2 years, right? So he does a revenue projection every biennium, and the state can't spend more than that. Okay, that's the pay-as-you-go limit. The tax spending limit is really, I think, going to be the issue this next session. And so essentially what that does is the state looks at all of its spending the prior biennium, all the money that was spent that was not constitutionally dedicated, right? So, things like the water infrastructure, right? That's constitutionally dedicated. Voters approve that in an election, and so it goes to that, and that's not counted. That spending's not counted for this spending limit. But FSP appropriations, that does count, right? That's not constitutionally dedicated. And so they look at all the state appropriations and say that, okay, that can't grow faster than the state's economy. Okay, and the growth rate that is plugged in there, that's determined by our elected officials, right? They sit on the legislative budget board. They all meet prior to the session and they vote on how fast they think the economy is growing, right? So it's not the point is it's not a precise number, right? It's not a number that's really grounded in any scientific methodology. It's the result of a political process, right? The people that sit on the LBB, the lieutenant governor, the speaker of the house, right? These are all elected officials. They're deciding that growth rate. That's what gets plugged in for the state spending limit. Okay, and so even if we point out that the economy is growing really quickly, it's growing at X, right? They still may come in less than that, and then that would result in a lower spending limit and essentially limit the amount of appropriations that the state can make, which would limit the amount of basic allotment increases we can fight for next session. It would impact the enhancements of the school safety allotment that we're looking at. And so really this spending limit is going to be really, really key, and it's something that we need to focus on in the coming months. And so, if they adopt a spending limit kind of in the range of what we're thinking, I said they have $27 billion. They can maybe spend half of that, maybe 40% of that, based on this spending limit. Okay, so they could come in and adopt a much higher spending limit than we're expecting, but sort of our expectation now is that they are not going to be able to spend the $27 billion that's in the bank now because of this tax spending limit. And then there's another spending limit that I'm going to kind of skip over in the interest of time. This is brand new and it's going to apply to this budget, and it's similar to the tax spending limit, but it looks at population and inflation. Okay, and so and then that is applied. That will come online for the 24-25 budget. So here's that timeline. November, December is where the LBB is going to decide that growth rate they're going to use for the economy, right? For that tax spending limit. And so we should know sort of how much of that $27 billion we can spend by the end of the year. And then in January, the controller will release information related to that pay-as-you-go limit. And again, all of those supplemental, all of those appropriation bills that the legislature passes, all of those have to comply with those spending limits. All right, I think, let's see, how much time we got? Romualdo, how much, we're supposed to be done at 10:30? Do you want us to? Okay. Okay. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about tax compression. This was Romualdo's request. So as y'all are aware, the tax compression has the value growth has been off the charts lately, and we expect the legislature to still do more next session. Lieutenant Governor wants to do $4 billion. The governor couldn't just sit by and let that you know, he had to one up the lieutenant governor, and so he wants to spend, you know, north of $13 billion on property tax relief. And so there's kind of this, you know, one-upmanship here that's occurring, leading, you know, we are in election season, and folks are trying to make property tax compression a priority. And so we're definitely seeing that, and I would expect that to continue during the legislative session. I'm going to hand it off to Amy. She's going to walk us through a little bit on tax compression and give us a refresher on how that works and how that can impact your budget.
Thanks, Josh. So this will be a review for most of y'all. We'll keep it kind of short and quick. We've got an example at the end. So let's talk about your M&O tax rate. As you guys probably know, it's divided into 3 different sections. The green part is your tier 1 tax rate. The second part is the second and third parts, the golden and copper pennies, are your tier 2 M&O tax rate. The golden pennies go up to 8 pennies, and the copper is an additional 9 pennies. Okay, so the green part, the tier 1 portion of your M&O rate, is subject to ongoing compression after HB3. So prior to HB3, most districts had their rate at $1, and after, well, starting in 2020, this was compressed down to 93 cents, and then we've seen more and more compression in the most recent years. And that is the additional compression in most recent years is determined by various formulas that are estimated by the property value growth estimate and your local property value growth. TEA is notified or tells districts, calculates their MCR, their maximum compressed tier 1 tax rate in the summer through the local property value survey. So some more on tier 1 compression on the statewide and local level. The statewide compression is determined by a formula on the comptroller's estimate of property value growth for the upcoming 2 years. If growth is in excess of 2.5%, there is going to be statewide compression. And there's an equity band where the legislature must, the difference between the highest compressed tax rate and the floor of that can't be more than 10%. And the state MCR is kind of the maximum MCR for all districts across the state. So for local compression, it's kind of similar. It's also determined by a statutory formula that depends on your local property value growth. There are some adjustments that are made if you have an expiring 313 or 311 agreement, and then also if you have a local optional homestead exemption. So basically, if your local growth is greater than 2.5%, you will see additional compression beyond what the state maximum MCR is. Okay, so here's kind of a timeline of recent years. In 2019, statewide compression was at 93%. This was set by HB3, and local compression, it was not applicable in 2019. In 2020, this 91.64% was calculated by the comptroller's growth estimate of 4.01%. So districts in the local side with more than 2.5% compression or property value growth would see additional compression. And that'll be the same for ongoing subsequent years. Back in 2021, on the statewide compression side, this rate dropped down, the compression dropped down a little bit to 91.34%. The comptroller estimated that this property value growth for that year would only be 1.84%, which is less than 2.5%. But during the last bit of that legislative session, the legislature tacked on an additional 3 pennies of compression. So that's why we see that percent difference right there. In tax year 2022, we see a compression percentage of 89.41%. This was based on a comptroller property value growth estimate of 4.36.
And I think real quick, I added the 23, 24 ones here.
Yes. So recently, very recently, the comptroller sent a letter to Texas leadership, to the LBB, and to TEA with their estimates for 23 and 24 property growth. In 2023, they're estimating 3.82%, and in 2024, they're estimating 4.56% growth. This is because they think that inflation will kind of slow down and it'll be kind of different than the crazy property value growth we saw in tax year 2022. So this is an estimate so far. If growth for 2023 is at 3.82%, this means that the new maximum MCR is going to be 0.8827, and the floor, which is 90% of that, will be 0.7944. For tax year 2024, with 4.56% growth, this will make the new maximum MCR at 0.8653, and the floor, which is 90% of that, will be 0.7787. So this is an estimate that the comptroller recently released. There will be an update to this property growth estimate in March, so we could see kind of different numbers from here on out. Okay, so let's talk about tax year 2022 compression, tier 1 compression. So as I mentioned before, we're going to skip to 2022. So this is the most recent year. The comptroller, as I mentioned before, estimated growth at 4.36%. This brought the maximum MCR at 89.41. And then the legislature budgeted an additional 3 cents of compression late in session. Okay. So this means that if your district had local growth exceeding 4.7%, they would have additional compression. And you can kind of follow along this downward sloping diagonal line right here and see that with more local growth, your district will experience more compression. And again, 90% of that, due to the equity band, means that the floor was at 80.846. So here's an example. We're going to go through all the tax years beginning in 2018. If all districts were compressed in this example, this district was compressed from $1 for their tier 1 tax rate to 93 cents in 2019. Further compressed, this is when the local property value survey started coming online. So if a district had more property value growth, they were compressed even more. In this example, that 0.93 in tax year 2019 was compressed to 0.9164 in tax year 2020. Okay, and from 2020 to 2021, there was growth less than less than 2.5%, but the legislature funded that additional three pennies. So this, or 0.003 additional tax tier one compression. So this brought it down to 91.34. And in the most recent tax year, with more property value growth of 4.36 and the additional 0.003 of additional compression, the max MCR, or in this example, their tier one, their M&O tier one tax rate was compressed down to 89.41. And then all those tier two pennies kind of float down on top. Okay, that was quick and dirty for tier one compression. Does anyone have any questions about that or anything else we've talked about?
I do just want to reiterate something that occasionally I have to argue with y'all about when it comes to tax compression. With tier one compression, I promise that it doesn't impact your budget. Okay, as your tier one rate gets compressed, your local share goes down, right? And so it sort of trades off. Okay. The analogy I give with school finance is that all of your entitlements, all your student counts, your weights that are in law, that essentially, that's the state determining how big of a bucket you get, right? The state is saying this district gets a bucket that can fit $50 million in it, right? This local share and the tier one rate, that just determines how much local dollars go in that bucket. It doesn't change the size of your bucket. It doesn't change the size of your entitlement. Okay, if you got $50 million because of the number of kids and the types of kids you have, you still get $50 million no matter what your tier one rate is. Okay, so tier one compression doesn't impact your budget on a net basis, right? It just kind of swaps out state and local funds. Okay, so I just want to make sure that you guys are clear on that relationship. If you're seeing something different in your template, what that almost always means is that you're not linking all the pieces together, right? So you got to move these three things together. You have values, you have your rate, and you have collections. Okay, before House Bill 3, they weren't linked in the same way, right? But now, if you move your values, you got to change your rate, right? You may get more compression with your rate, and then you got to change your collections, right? And so you got to keep all three pieces moving together in your templates, okay? So if you're seeing as you're going in there in your free time and messing around with your template, and you're seeing, hey, Josh told me that compression is supposed to hurt my budget, but I'm seeing that it does. Make sure that you're keeping those three pieces synced up, right? Your values, your tax rate, and your collections. Okay, so that's pretty much every time when I have to have that conversation, that's usually the culprit is they've changed their values, but they didn't do the compression or vice versa, right? So just make sure that you're keeping those three things together as you're projecting out in future years. The only other the thing that will change your budget, right, is your tier two pennies, right? So tier one is the compression Amy just talked about. Tier two are the golden and copper pennies that sit on top. If you go out for a TRE or you adopt new golden pennies, right, through the board, or you adopt disaster pennies, we talk about disaster pennies a lot, that can increase your budget, right? That'll grow the size of your bucket, right? And so there is some interaction there with that portion of your tax rate and your sort of aggregate budget, right? Tier two pennies impact your budget. This compression of tier one should be budget neutral. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, all right. I think we're a little over time, so I can take any quick questions, or you guys can meet me in the back and we can talk more. Oh, okay. Oscar, can you read that question to us from the voice in the sky?
Yes, the question is, the golden pennies of our tier two portion will never be compressed?
Not under current law, no. No, I mean, they could change the law and do that, but not under current law. There's no mechanism to compress golden pennies. You have 8 of them, right? And those are compression free as they sit currently. Or I'm sorry, you could have 8 of them. Not all districts do.